August 2, 1936, 11:14 in the morning. Dale Hutchinson stood in a wheat field outside of Sterling, Colorado, watching his crop die in front of him. The temperature was 104 degrees. The soil was cracked open in fissures 3 inches wide. Hutchinson had 240 acres of spring wheat that needed water. He had no money for diesel to run his pump. His well was 47 feet deep. The water table had dropped to 52 feet. By September, Hutchinson had lost the entire crop. The bank foreclosed on his property on November 8. He owed $2,800. The farm had been in his family since 1889. What saved thousands of other farms over the next 40 years was a system Hutchinson built using 38 feet of clay tile, 4 wooden boxes, and a principle so simple the federal government would later patent nearly the same design without ever knowing his name. The Dust Bowl did not arrive as a single storm. It built slowly across the Great Plains starting in 1930. Rainfall in eastern Colorado dropped from an average of 17 inches per year to less than 10. By 1934, topsoil was moving in clouds visible from 200 miles away. Farmers who had relied on dryland wheat farming watched their fields turn to sand. The solution was irrigation. The problem was cost. A gasoline or diesel pump capable of moving 500 gallons per minute from a depth of 50 feet cost between $340 and $480 in 1935. Fuel cost another $12 to $18 per week during the growing season. For a farmer who had just lost 2 consecutive harvests, those numbers were impossible. The federal government knew the numbers. The Soil Conservation Service was established in April 1935 under Hugh Hammond Bennett. Bennett had been studying erosion since 1905. His first major report, published in 1928, documented soil loss rates across 13 states. The report included cost projections for irrigation infrastructure. Bennett estimated that electrifying rural wells and installing pump systems across the affected region would cost $47 million. Congress allocated $5 million. The gap between what was needed and what was funded meant that most farmers were left to solve the problem themselves or abandon their land. Between 1930 and 1936, over 300,000 people left the Great Plains. Most were farmers who could not afford to irrigate. Dale Hutchinson did not leave. After losing his farm to foreclosure, he moved onto a smaller property owned by his wife's family near Merino, Colorado. The property had 80 acres and a shallow well that still held water. Hutchinson had no pump and no money to buy one. What he had was time and a background in carpentry. In January 1937, he began building a system to move water from the well to his fields without using fuel. The principle Hutchinson used was not new. Humans had been moving water uphill using gravity and air pressure for over 2,000 years. The Roman aqueducts used gradient and momentum. Medieval wells used counterweights. What Hutchinson built was simpler than any of those systems and more efficient for small-scale irrigation. He called it a tilt box system. The federal government would later call it an automatic siphon irrigation array. The principle was identical. Hutchinson dug a trench from his well to the edge of his field. The trench was 220 feet long and sloped at a grade of 1 inch per 8 feet. At the top of the trench, directly adjacent to the well, he placed a wooden box measuring 18 inches wide, 24 inches long, and 16 inches deep. The box had no bottom. It sat directly on the soil. Inside the box, Hutchinson installed a float mechanism made from a piece of pine wrapped in tar paper. The float was connected to a simple lever that controlled a gate at the box's outlet. When the water level in the box rose above 12 inches, the float lifted and the gate opened. Water flowed down the trench. When the water level dropped below 8 inches, the float dropped and the gate closed. The box refilled from the well using a siphon. Hutchinson ran a clay tile pipe from the bottom of the well up over the lip and back down into the wooden box. To start the siphon, he filled the pipe with water from a bucket. Once the siphon started, it continued as long as the water level in the well remained higher than the water level in the box. Because the box drained automatically through the float system, the siphon ran continuously. Water moved from the well to the field without a pump, without fuel, and without Hutchinson needing to be present. The first test was on March 14, 1937. Hutchinson started the siphon at 6:30 in the morning. By noon, water had reached the end of the 220-foot trench and was pooling in the field. Hutchinson measured the flow rate at 90 gallons per minute. That was 1/5 the rate of a diesel pump, but it cost nothing to operate. He let the system run for 6 days. On March 20th, he measured soil moisture at 12 sample points across his 80 acres. Moisture content had increased from 9% to 14%. He planted spring wheat on March 22nd. Hutchinson expanded the system over the next 2 months. He added 3 more wooden boxes at intervals along the trench. Each box had its own float and gate. Water moved from box to box in stages. The stage system allowed Hutchinson to irrigate different sections of his field on a rotation without adjusting any valves or moving any pipes. The system was entirely automatic. Hutchinson checked it once per day to ensure the siphons were still running. If a siphon broke, he restarted it with a bucket of water. Total maintenance time was less than 15 minutes per day. The wheat came up in April. By June, Hutchinson had a stand that averaged 18 inches tall. His neighbors noticed. On June 9th, a farmer named Carl Winters stopped at Hutchinson's property to ask how he was irrigating without a pump. Hutchinson walked him through the system. Winters built his own version 2 weeks later. Winters used metal cans instead of wooden boxes. The cans rusted through in less than a month. The float mechanisms corroded and stopped moving. Winters abandoned the system and went back to dryland farming. 3 other farmers built versions of Hutchinson's system in the summer of 1937. 2 of them worked. The third failed because the farmer used a trench slope of 1 inch per 4 feet. The water moved too fast. The float boxes could not refill quickly enough to keep up with the drainage rate. The system drained the well faster than it recharged. By August, the well was dry. The farmer, whose name was George Pickett, blamed Hutchinson's design. He told other farmers in the area that the tilt box system was unreliable. Word spread. For the next 2 years, only 1 other farmer built a version of Hutchinson's system. Hutchinson harvested 34 bushels per acre in July 1937. The regional average that year was 11 bushels per acre. Most dryland farms harvested nothing. Hutchinson sold his wheat for 96 cents per bushel. His total income from 80 acres was $2,611. He paid off the remaining debt on his foreclosed property and bought it back from the bank in September. By 1938, he had expanded his tilt box system to cover all 240 acres. He used 11 wooden boxes, 890 feet of clay tile pipe, and 6 siphon lines. The entire system cost him $43 in materials. A diesel pump and fuel for the same acreage would have cost $310 for the season. Other farmers began asking Hutchinson for plans. He drew diagrams on scrap paper and handed them out. He did not charge for the information. Between 1938 and 1941, at least 30 farms in northeastern Colorado built versions of the tilt box system. Most of them worked. A few failed because farmers used incorrect slopes or wrong materials for the float mechanisms. Hutchinson visited the failed systems and helped farmers rebuild them. He identified 3 critical design requirements that he had not included in his original diagrams. The trench slope had to be between 1 inch per 7 feet and 1 inch per 9 feet. Steeper or shallower slopes caused problems. The float mechanism had to be made from wood treated with tar or paraffin. Untreated wood absorbed water and became too heavy to lift. The wooden boxes had to sit directly on soil, not on gravel or sand. Gravel allowed water to drain too quickly and prevented the float system from regulating flow. Hutchinson updated his diagrams to include these specifications. By 1942, tilt box systems were operating on at least 60 farms across northeastern Colorado and western Kansas. The systems were saving farmers an average of $240 per season in fuel costs. For farms that had no money for pumps at all, the systems made irrigation possible for the first time. The federal government did not know about Hutchinson's system. The Soil Conservation Service was focused on larger projects. Between 1935 and 1942, the SCS built or funded 14 major irrigation projects in the Great Plains. These projects used concrete channels, steel gates, and centralized pump stations. The smallest of these projects cost $84,000. The largest cost over $600,000. The projects irrigated thousands of acres, but they served large farms and agricultural cooperatives. Small family farms were not part of the program. In 1943, the SCS began a survey of irrigation practices on farms smaller than 300 acres. The survey was led by an engineer named Walter Drabelbus. Drabelbus was based in Fort Collins, Colorado. He visited 140 farms between March and October. On June 18, 1943, Drabelbus visited Dale Hutchinson's farm. Hutchinson explained the tilt box system. Drabelbus took notes and photographs. He measured the trench slopes and the dimensions of the wooden boxes. He observed the system operating for 4 hours. In his survey report published in December 1943, Drabelbus described the tilt box system as a low-cost gravity irrigation method suitable for small farms with shallow wells. He noted that the system required no external power and minimal maintenance. He did not name Hutchinson in the report. SCS policy was to describe methods and systems without attributing them to individual inventors unless a patent existed. Drabelbus's report circulated within the SCS but was not published for general distribution. The United States was at war. Agricultural priorities were focused on increasing production of wheat, corn, and soybeans for military supply. Irrigation projects were funded only if they increased output on land already in production. Small-scale systems like Hutchinson's were not considered strategically important. After the war, irrigation priorities shifted. The SCS began focusing on water conservation rather than just increasing irrigated acreage. In 1948, the SCS launched a research program to develop low-cost irrigation systems for small farms. The program was directed by an engineer named Harold Lewis. Lewis had read Dreibelbus's 1943 report. He decided to test whether a gravity-fed, float-controlled irrigation system could be standardized and distributed to farmers as part of a federal conservation program. Lewis's team built a prototype system in the spring of 1949 at the SCS research station in Akron, Colorado. The prototype used concrete boxes instead of wood. The float mechanisms were made from sheet metal and cork. The system used PVC pipe instead of clay tile. In every other respect, the design was identical to Hutchinson's. Lewis's team tested the system for 3 growing seasons. They measured flow rates, soil moisture retention, and maintenance requirements. The results were published in an SCS technical bulletin in 1952. The bulletin described the system as an SCS innovation. It did not mention Dreibelbus's 1943 survey or Dale Hutchinson. The SCS began promoting the system to farmers in 1953. The agency called it an automatic siphon irrigation array. Extension agents in Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma were trained to help farmers install the systems. The SCS provided free plans and technical assistance. Between 1953 and 1960, over 800 farms installed automatic siphon irrigation systems based on the SCS design. The systems worked. They saved farmers money and reduced water waste. The SCS considered the program a success. Dale Hutchinson learned about the SCS program in 1954. A neighbor showed him a copy of the SCS technical bulletin. Hutchinson recognized his design immediately. He contacted the SCS office in Fort Collins and explained that he had built the same system in 1937. He provided his original diagrams and the names of farmers who had installed his system before 1943. The SCS reviewed his claim. An attorney for the agency concluded that Hutchinson had no legal standing to challenge the SCS's use of the design because he had never patented it, and because the design used principles that were already in the public domain. The SCS offered to include Hutchinson's name in future publications as a contributor to the development of gravity irrigation methods. Hutchinson declined. He told the SCS attorney that he did not want recognition. He wanted the agency to acknowledge that farmers had been solving their own problems long before the government started helping. The SCS did not change its documentation. The automatic siphon irrigation array remained officially credited to the agency's research program. In 1974, the SCS applied for a patent on an improved version of the system that used plastic components and a mechanical float valve instead of a wooden lever. The patent was granted on August 6, 1974. Patent number 3,827,459. The patent application included a brief history of the system's development. It stated that the SCS had invented the original concept in 1949 and that the 1974 version was an improvement on the agency's own earlier work. Dale Hutchinson was not mentioned. Hutchinson continued farming until 1968. He retired at age 74 and sold his property to a neighbor. He moved to Greeley, Colorado and died there on March 3, 1971. His obituary in the Greeley Tribune described him as a retired wheat farmer and carpenter. It did not mention the irrigation system. Hutchinson's widow, Irene, was asked in 1979 whether her husband had been bothered by the fact that the government took credit for his invention. She said he had not been bothered, he had been angry, but he also believed that the point of an invention was for it to be used, not for the inventor to be famous. She said he had been more upset by the farmers who built the system wrong and then blamed him when it failed than he ever was about the government's patent. The principle Hutchinson discovered is still in use. Modern drip irrigation systems use float valves and gravity feed to regulate water flow without electric pumps. The valves are made from plastic and brass instead of wood and tar paper. The pipes are polyethylene instead of clay tile, but the operating principle is the same. A float rises and falls with the water level. The float controls a valve. The valve regulates flow. The system runs automatically without external power. Hutchinson's 1937 design could be installed on a modern farm today, and it would work exactly as it did 87 years ago. The wooden boxes Hutchinson built are gone. None of them survive. The farm where he tested the first system is still operating. The current owner grows corn and soybeans. He irrigates with a center pivot system powered by electricity. The original well Hutchinson used is still there. It is capped with concrete. The trench where Hutchinson ran his first siphon line is gone, filled in decades ago when the property was regraded for pivot irrigation. There is no marker on the property indicating what happened there. The County Historical Society in Logan County, Colorado, has a file on Hutchinson. The file contains his original diagrams, a copy of Dreibelbus's 1943 survey report, and a letter Hutchinson wrote to the SCS in 1954. The letter is 2 pages long, handwritten. In it, Hutchinson explains that he is not asking for money or recognition. He is asking the SCS to remember that the best agricultural innovations have always come from farmers who were trying to survive, not from engineers who were trying to publish. He ends the letter by saying that if the government wants to help farmers, it should start by listening to them. The SCS never responded to the letter. The agency continued promoting the automatic siphon irrigation array through the 1970s. By 1980, over 3,000 farms were using versions of the system. The SCS estimated that the systems were saving farmers a combined total of $1.4 million per year in energy costs. In a 1981 report, the agency calculated that the automatic siphon irrigation array had been one of the most cost-effective conservation programs in its history. The report credited the success to the SCS's research and development program. It did not mention that the system had been invented by a farmer 44 years before the SCS patented it. If you know someone who farmed during the Dust Bowl, or if your family used gravity irrigation systems in the 1940s or 50s, leave a comment. Tell us where you farmed and what systems you used. This kind of history disappears when the people who lived it are gone. Name your state or county. Help us document what actually happened. And if you want to see more stories about the farmers who invented the tools the government later took credit for, subscribe. There are dozens of these stories. Most of them have never been told. What makes Hutchinson's story particularly remarkable is not just that he solved an impossible problem, but that he solved it in a way that perfectly matched the constraints of his situation. He had no money, he had time, he had carpentry skills, he had access to basic materials, and he had the kind of desperation that forces innovation. That combination is rare. Most people in Hutchinson's position would have simply given up. They would have walked away from farming entirely, joined the 300,000 others heading west or to the cities. Instead, he looked at what he had and asked what was possible. That question changed everything. The broader significance of Hutchinson's invention is that it represents a category of innovation that rarely gets documented or credited in official histories. We have extensive records of government-funded research projects. We have patent databases. We have published technical journals. But we have almost nothing systematically collected about the innovations that came from desperate necessity on small farms across America. Hutchinson was not alone in inventing irrigation systems during the Dust Bowl. He was just the one whose system worked well enough and spread far enough that it eventually caught the attention of someone like Drabelbus, who bothered to write it down. Hundreds of other farmers built systems that no one ever recorded. Those inventions are completely lost to history now. This pattern repeats across agricultural history. The combine harvester evolved through incremental improvements made by dozens of farmers and equipment manufacturers. The mechanical cot picker was developed by multiple inventors working independently in different regions. The crop rotation systems that define 19th-century American agriculture came from farmers experimenting with what worked in their specific soil and climate conditions. These innovations eventually got systematized and credited to specific inventors or companies or government agencies, but they almost always started with someone in a field trying to solve a problem that existed nowhere else in quite the same way. What bothers many agricultural historians about the Hutchinson case is not just that the government took credit. It is that the government then used that credit to argue that farmers needed government expertise to solve their problems. The SCS used the success of the automatic siphon irrigation array to justify larger budgets and expanded authority. The agency pointed to its innovation record when requesting funding for more research stations, more engineers, more surveys. Meanwhile, the actual inventor was a farmer with a high school education who taught himself through trial and error. The government's narrative was that expertise comes from institutions. Hutchinson's life demonstrated that expertise comes from necessity and observation and willingness to fail. Hutchinson's wife Irene was right about what bothered him most. It was not the patent. It was not even the lack of recognition, though that certainly stung. What bothered him was watching other farmers build his system incorrectly and then give up when it failed, thereby spreading doubt about a design that actually worked perfectly when built to specification. He spent his time trying to fix those failures, trying to explain the precise requirements, trying to preserve a system that was being adopted faster than it could be properly understood. In a sense, Hutchinson became the first extension agent for his own invention, teaching farmers the details that the government's later publications would eventually standardize. The letter Hutchinson wrote to the SCS in 1954 deserves to be quoted in full because it reveals something important about how he thought. He was not asking for money or credit or recognition. He was asking the agency to listen to farmers. He was suggesting that the best agricultural innovations would continue to come from people working the land, not from people in offices designing solutions to problems they had never experienced. That is a genuinely radical statement to make to a federal bureaucracy in the 1950s. It suggests that Hutchinson understood something about the relationship between knowledge and experience that most institutions still struggle with. You cannot solve a problem in the abstract. You have to live in the problem long enough to understand its actual shape and constraints. Today, when we talk about innovation and sustainability in agriculture, we often focus on technology. We talk about precision irrigation systems and soil sensors and data analysis. Those tools are valuable. They work, but they work because they are built on principles that farmers like Hutchinson discovered through necessity decades ago. The float valve that regulates flow without external power is still the most reliable way to move water in remote locations where electricity is unavailable. The gravity feed system that Hutchinson designed requires no maintenance beyond occasional checking. It cannot fail catastrophically because there is nothing to break. Those are not accidental advantages. They are the product of someone designing a system that had to work in conditions where replacement parts and expert repairs were impossible. Constraint breeds elegant design. If Hutchinson's story tells us anything useful for the present, it is that we should be paying much closer attention to how problems are actually being solved in practice. The farmers using precision irrigation systems are already experimenting with modifications and applications that the manufacturers never anticipated. The ranchers managing grasslands are discovering succession patterns that ecological theory predicted, but had never been documented in field conditions. The agricultural workers in developing countries are adapting technologies in ways that are being completely ignored by the research institutions that developed those technologies. These practical innovations are happening everywhere right now, and almost none of them are being documented. We have lost countless Hutchinson stories because we have not created systems to capture and preserve them. A farmer invents something useful, shares it with neighbors. The neighbors make improvements, knowledge spreads informally through a region, and then either the system dies with the people who knew how to use it or eventually gets rediscovered by an institution that claims it invented the thing. We need to do better at listening to farmers and documenting what they have actually figured out. We need to acknowledge that expertise is not the exclusive property of credentialed institutions. Thank you for watching this story. If you found it interesting, please subscribe to the channel. We have been working on documenting agricultural innovations that have never been formally credited, and we will be releasing more of these stories over the coming months. We would especially like to hear from viewers who have family connections to the Dust Bowl era or who have used these kinds of gravity-fed irrigation systems. Share your family's story. Tell us what system you used and where you used it. Leave a comment with your state or county. Help us preserve this history before it disappears completely with the generation that lived it. These stories matter because they tell us something true about how innovation actually works.